My name is Claire, and I'm 22 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened last spring, and I still think about it almost every day. I should start by saying I've always been a pretty practical person. I don't spook easily. I don't believe in ghosts, and I'm not the type to imagine things. So when I started to feel like something was wrong in that house, I took it seriously. Just not seriously enough. Not at first. The house belonged to my mom's co-worker, a woman named Linda, and her husband Paul. They were a nice couple in their 50s who were taking a trip to Europe for 2 weeks. They needed someone to collect the mail, water the plants, and make sure the house didn't burn down. My mom volunteered me. The pay was decent for doing basically nothing, so I agreed. The house was in a quiet suburban neighborhood about 20 minutes from where I live. Nice area. Big houses, good lighting. The kind of street where everyone knows their neighbors. I wasn't planning to stay there every night, just a few nights a week. The rest of the time I'd stop by in the morning to check on things and then go back to my own apartment. Linda gave me a full tour before they left. 2-story house, 3 bedrooms, a finished basement, and a large backyard. She showed me where the spare key was, walked me through the alarm code, and pointed out a few quirks about the place. She also mentioned their neighbor on the right, a man named Dennis, who was friendly and kept an eye on the street. She said if I ever felt uncomfortable or needed anything, Dennis was the one to knock on. Before she left, she reminded me that the side gate to the backyard had a latch that sometimes didn't catch all the way, and to make sure it was properly shut when I went in or out. That detail stuck with me later. The first few days were completely uneventful. I checked the house in the mornings, watered the plants, collected the mail, and left. Nothing unusual. On the 4th day, I decided to spend the night since I had an early errand nearby the next morning. That night, I made dinner in their kitchen and settled in to watch TV. At some point, I used the can opener to open a can of soup and left it on the counter next to the stove. I remember it specifically because I thought about washing it and then decided I'd deal with it in the morning. I went to bed around 11. Slept fine. When I woke up the next morning, the can opener was in the dish rack, washed and dried. I stood there staring at it for probably a full minute. I knew I hadn't washed it. I was certain. But I also couldn't explain it any other way, so I told myself I must have done it half asleep and just didn't remember. I let it go. I shouldn't have. 2 nights later, I stayed over again. Before going to bed, I made sure to lock the back door. I tested the handle twice. Locked. When I woke up the next morning, the back door was unlocked. This time I couldn't rationalize it. I hadn't gone outside. I hadn't unlocked that door. I sat in the kitchen for a long time just staring at the handle. The most logical explanation I could come up with was that I'd had some kind of sleepwalking episode, which had never happened to me before in my life. I almost called my mom to tell her something felt off, but I didn't want to be the person who bailed on a simple house-sitting job because of a can opener and an unlocked door. So I stayed quiet. But I started paying closer attention after that. I began leaving small things in specific spots whenever I left the house. A pen balanced on the edge of the bathroom counter. A folded receipt tucked into the handle of the back door. Little things that I would definitely notice if they'd been disturbed. For a few days, nothing moved, and I started to genuinely wonder if I was losing my mind. Then one afternoon, I came back after a few hours away and noticed the smell immediately. It wasn't a bad smell. It was just different. Like someone had been in the house recently. I know that sounds vague, but it's one of those things you can only pick up on when you've been alone in a space long enough to know what it normally smells like. I checked the back door. Unlocked again. I walked through every single room, every closet, under both beds, the basement, all of it. No one was there. But in the guest bedroom, The pillow on the bed had an indent in it, like someone had been lying there. I went next door and knocked on Dennis's door. He was home and he took me seriously, which I was grateful for. He walked through the house with me and didn't find anyone. But while we were standing in the kitchen, he told me something that changed everything. He said Linda and Paul had a grown son named Marcus, who had lived in the house until about a year ago. According to Dennis, there had been some kind of falling out, and Marcus wasn't supposed to have access to the property anymore. He also mentioned that he'd noticed an unfamiliar car parked across the street a couple of times. I called Linda in Europe that same evening. She went quiet when I told her what had been happening. Then she told me that Marcus still had a key. She said she had asked him to return it months ago, and he had told her he did. She apologized and sounded genuinely upset. She told me to call the police and that she would deal with Marcus when she got home. The police came, took a report, and told me that without catching him in the act, there wasn't much they could do. They suggested I add a chain lock to the back door from the inside, which Dennis helped me do that same night. I stayed one more night in that house. I didn't sleep. Around 2 a.m, I heard the back door handle being tested from the outside. Just once. Then footsteps on the back patio. Then nothing. I lay completely still in that bed until the sun came up. Then I packed everything, left a note for Linda, and went home. I finished the remaining days of the house-sitting job in day trips only. I never spent another night there. When Linda and Paul came home, they sat Marcus down and went through the house together. That's when they realized things were missing. Small things. Money from a jar Linda kept on the kitchen counter. A ring. A watch of Paul's. Things that had been disappearing so gradually they hadn't even noticed until they looked carefully. And the whole time he was taking those things, I was there, sleeping in their house, completely unaware. What bothers me more than any of it is what Linda told me at the end of our conversation. She said Marcus had been watching the house to learn my schedule. He knew which nights I stayed and which nights I didn't. He had been timing his visits around me. The entire time I thought I was watching that house. Someone else was watching me. I think about the indent in that pillow a lot. I think about the fact that he was in that house while I was in it, just in a different room, and I never knew. I've house sat for other people since then, but I always add my own lock now. First thing, before I even put my bag down. Some lessons you only need to learn once.
My name is Jake, and I'm 23 years old. What I'm about to tell you is the reason I don't date anymore. Not casually, not seriously, not at all. Some people think that's an overreaction. I stopped trying to explain myself a long time ago. I had been talking to Kayla for about 2 weeks before we actually met in person. We matched on an app, started texting, and it turned into one of those conversations you don't want to put down. She was funny. She was easy to talk to. She had this way of responding to things I said that made me feel like she'd actually read every word instead of just skimming. When we finally agreed to meet for dinner, it felt less like a first date and more like catching up with someone I already knew. I was nervous in the good way, not the bad way. We went to a restaurant downtown. Nothing fancy, just a solid place with good food and a bar attached. The kind of spot where you can linger over drinks without feeling rushed. The date went well. Better than well, honestly. She laughed at the right moments, and so did I. We talked for almost 4 hours without either of us checking the time. By the time we walked out to my car after midnight, I was already thinking about a second date. I remember feeling genuinely lucky, which is not something I usually let myself feel. That's the last normal memory I have from that night. We were walking through the parking lot, maybe 20 feet from my car, when the woman approached us. She came from the direction of the bar's side entrance, moving fast, and she was clearly upset. She looked to be in her early 30s, dark hair, dressed like she had been out for the night. She was breathing hard and glancing back over her shoulder toward the building. Before I could say anything, she was already talking, apologizing for interrupting, explaining she needed help, saying there was a man inside the bar who had been following her all evening and threatening her. She said she had tried to wait him out, but he was still in there and she was afraid to stand outside alone waiting for a ride. I looked at Kayla. Kayla looked at me. The woman looked genuinely scared. She said she just needed a ride to a friend's place nearby, 10 minutes away at most. Her voice was shaking just enough. I didn't think about it. I said yes. Kayla nodded. We were two people at the end of a great night, and this woman looked like she needed help. It took less than 5 seconds to decide. She got into the back seat behind Kayla. I pulled up the address she gave me, and we headed out of the lot. She thanked us several times in the first few minutes, said we were good people, said she didn't know what she would have done without us. I told her it was no problem and asked what had happened with the man inside. She said he was her ex, that he'd been showing up places she went, and that tonight he had cornered her near the bathrooms and said things that frightened her. I told her that sounded scary and that she should consider filing a report. Then, maybe 2 minutes later, she referred to him as someone she barely knew. A guy she had gone on a couple of dates with, nothing serious. I noticed the shift. The first time he was an ex who had a pattern of showing up. The second time he was practically a stranger. I didn't say anything because I figured she was still rattled and not choosing her words carefully. I told myself that made sense. Then she asked how long Kayla and I had been together. We told her it was actually our first date. She laughed and said we seemed like a natural fit. She asked where we had met. I told her. She asked where I lived. I gave a vague answer and changed the subject. Kayla was quiet. I glanced at her and she gave me a small smile. I reached over and touched her hand briefly, and she didn't pull away. About 5 minutes into the drive, the woman told me to take a right instead of following my GPS. She said the route it had chosen was always slow at night, and she knew a better way. I didn't question it. She seemed confident. I turned right. A few minutes later, she told me to take another turn, then another, after that. I glanced at the map on my phone at a red light, and something felt off. The blue line of my original route was behind us now. We were heading away from the address she'd given me, not toward it. Away from the center of the city, away from the residential streets, toward a stretch of the city that was darker and quieter. I mentioned it. I said it looked like we were moving in the wrong direction. She said no, we were almost there. This street connected back to her area just ahead. Her voice when she said it was completely level, not reassuring like someone who understood I was confused, just flat. The same way someone sounds when they're not actually listening to you because they already know what you're going to say. Something in my chest shifted, not a thought exactly. More like a physical feeling, like the air in the car had changed. I looked at Kayla. I was going to say something. I don't remember what. And then I don't remember anything else. I woke up in the driver's seat. It was dark outside. Not city dark with ambient light from buildings and street lamps. Just dark. I was parked on a street I didn't recognize, somewhere with no businesses and no other cars, the kind of block that exists in a city but doesn't feel like it. My head felt wrong, heavy and slow, like waking up from a fever. I sat there for a moment, trying to understand where I was. Then I looked at the passenger seat. Kayla was gone. I turned around. The back seat was empty. No woman, no Kayla, no bags, no phone left behind. Nothing. Just my car, parked on a dark street, and me alone in it. I grabbed my phone. It was 2:17 in the morning. The last thing I remembered clearly, it had been just after midnight. I had over an hour I couldn't account for. I called Kayla. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called again immediately. Voicemail again. I got out of the car and looked up and down the street. I drove around the surrounding blocks for what felt like a long time, just driving in circles with no idea what I was looking for. Eventually, I pulled over and called 911. 2 officers arrived within 15 minutes. I told them everything I just told you. The date, the parking lot, the woman approaching us, the address, the route changes, the last thing I remembered. They listened and asked questions and took notes. About an hour into the conversation, after one of them had stepped away to take a call, I noticed a shift in how the other one was looking at me. They had already spoken to the woman. She had shown up at a hospital about 2 miles from where I was parked. She had presented herself as a victim. She told them that Kayla and I had picked her up outside the bar, which matched the security footage, so that much was confirmed, but that during the drive I had become angry and threatening. She said she had been frightened. She said she jumped from the car when it slowed at an intersection and ran. She had marks on her arms consistent with a fall on pavement. Her story had no gaps in it. Mine had a gap of over an hour that I could not explain. I want to be clear about what the next several months looked like because I don't want to gloss over it. I was treated as a person of interest. I cooperated completely. I gave them access to my phone, my location history, everything. I submitted to questioning multiple times. Kayla's family was told about me. Her mother called me once, and I told her everything I've told you. There was a long silence after I finished, and then she said she believed me in a voice that didn't sound like she did. I understood that. Kayla's face was on local news. A search was organized. The security footage from the restaurant's parking lot confirmed the three of us getting into my car around 12:15. It showed nothing useful beyond that. The woman gave investigators a name and an address. The name came back with a limited record. The address was real. When officers went there, she was cooperative, calm, and consistent. Her story never wavered. There was not enough evidence to charge her with anything. She was released. I don't know her real name. I'm not sure anyone does. Kayla was never found. Her case is still open. I don't know what that means in practical terms because no one has contacted me about it in months. I have thought about that parking lot every single day since it happened. The moment Kayla looked at me and I looked at her, and we both just nodded. How easy it was. How obvious the right thing seemed. A woman was scared and needed help, and we had a car. That was the entire calculation. 4 seconds and a nod. I spent a long time after that trying to figure out what I had missed, what warning signs I had dismissed, whether I could have seen it coming in time to change anything. The story that kept changing, the route being redirected, the questions she asked about us instead of just being relieved. I went over it until I had memorized every detail, and it didn't help at all. 8 months after Kayla disappeared, I received a message through a missing persons forum I had posted on. It was from a man I had never heard of. He said he had been following my case and needed to ask me something specific. He wanted to know if the woman who approached us had dark hair, if she had come from the direction of a bar's entrance, if she had said there was a man inside who was threatening her and that she just needed a short ride to a friend's place nearby. I felt my hands go cold reading it. He told me his story. 4 years before the night I'm describing, he had been on a first date. A woman matching the same description had approached them outside a bar. Same story, same setup. He said yes. His date disappeared. He woke up in his car, alone with a gap in his memory. He was investigated. The woman he had picked up gave a statement that made him look guilty. The case dragged on for months. His date eventually came back. She was found in another state, traumatized, with no clear memory of most of what had happened to her. She survived. She recovered, partially. The woman from that night was never identified or charged. The case went cold. He had spent years looking for other incidents that matched the pattern. He said mine was the closest he had ever found. I gave that information to the investigators working Kayla's case. I don't know what they've done with it. I don't know if it matters at this point. I don't know how many times this woman has done what she did to us, or what she does with the people she takes, or whether there's a way to find her. I don't know if Kayla is alive. That last one is the one I can't put down. I go back and forth between letting myself hope and knowing that hope might be the cruelest thing I can do to myself. Either way, I don't get an answer. Either way, I just have to keep living with it. I helped someone who told me she was in danger. I believed her because she looked like she needed to be believed, and because saying yes felt like the obvious, decent thing to do. Kayla agreed with me. She nodded. She was the kind of person who would have nodded. That is the last thing I know for certain about her. That she was the kind of person who would help. I don't know what to do with that either. My name is Nathan, and I'm 44 years old. About 8 months ago, I moved to a new city after my divorce. Fresh start, new apartment, the whole thing. I wasn't running from anything dramatic. I just needed to be somewhere that didn't feel like a reminder of everything that had changed. I had started to feel okay about it when I got the call from the lawyer. A man named Roy Harlan had died. He was, according to the lawyer, my mother's second cousin. He had left me a storage unit. I didn't remember Roy clearly. I had a vague image of a quiet man at a few family reunions when I was young. He kept to himself, never talked much, always seemed to be watching rather than participating. My mother mentioned him occasionally, but never with warmth or detail. He was one of those peripheral family members you acknowledge and forget. Why he left me anything was immediately strange to me, but the lawyer said there was no one else. The storage unit was about 2 hours from where I now lived, in a facility just outside the town where Roy had spent most of his life. I drove out on a Saturday morning expecting to find furniture, boxes of old clothes, maybe some antiques worth selling. The key the lawyer mailed me was old and slightly rusted. When I unlocked the unit and rolled up the door, I stood there for a moment just taking it in. There was almost nothing there. For a unit that size, I expected clutter. Instead, there was a metal filing cabinet against the back wall and about 6 cardboard boxes lined up neatly beside it. That was it. No furniture, no bags, no personal effects you would expect from a man's entire life. Just the cabinet and the boxes, as if someone had deliberately cleared everything out and left only these things behind. I opened the first box. It was full of printed photographs, hundreds of them, stacked in no particular order. I picked up a handful and started flipping through. Suburban streets, a park I didn't recognize at first, a school building, a house with a blue front door that took me a few seconds to place. It was my childhood home. I set the photos down and told myself there was probably a reasonable explanation. Maybe Roy had visited my family at some point. Maybe these were from a time I didn't remember. I moved to the filing cabinet. It had 4 drawers. All of them were packed with folders, each one labeled with a date range going back decades. I pulled out one from the early 1990s and opened it. Inside were handwritten pages, dense, neat, organized. Times of day, locations, brief descriptions of movements and routines. It read like some kind of log. I stood there skimming it, not fully understanding what I was looking at, until I turned to the 3rd page and saw my name. Not a common name, my full name, my middle name included. I put the folder down and stood very still. Then I pulled out another folder, and another. Every single one was about me. My elementary school, the sports teams I played on, the names of my childhood friends, my first job, my first apartment. Every city I had ever lived in listed with dates of when I arrived and when I left. There were photos in some of the folders that I recognized from my own life. Me at maybe 10 or 11 years old in my front yard, me walking to school, me as a teenager in a parking lot I could still place. Photos I had never seen before in my life. Photos I had no idea existed. I don't know how long I stood in that unit. I eventually called my mother. She went quiet when I told her what I was looking at. She said she didn't know much about Roy. Said he had connected with her side of the family when she was young, through her mother's social circle. Said she had never questioned it because he was always harmless. Quiet. Never did anything wrong that she knew of. She sounded shaken in a way I hadn't heard from her in a long time. I did some searching on my phone that same afternoon. The name Roy Harlan came up in older court records from another state. Nothing violent, but connected to fraud and identity-related charges from the late 1980s, filed under what appeared to be a completely different legal name. His real name, based on what I could find, was not Roy Harlan. I reported everything to the police. An officer came out, looked through some of the materials, and told me that since Roy was deceased, there was no active criminal case to pursue. He said I could file a report for documentation purposes, which I did. He took photos of a few of the folders, but left everything with me. I spent that evening going through the remaining boxes, still trying to understand how deep this went. Most of it was more of the same. More logs, more printed photos, more careful records of a life I didn't know anyone had been watching. I was near the bottom of the last box when I found a second folder I had somehow missed. It was thinner than the others, tucked flat against the side. I opened it. The subject wasn't me. I recognized her immediately. The photos, the logs, the campus address, her class schedule written out by hand, a description of the car she drives and where she parks it, photos of her walking across campus, sitting outside a coffee shop, getting into her car in a parking garage at night. It was my daughter. She's 19. She goes to college in another state. The handwriting in this folder looked slightly different from the others, less neat, more hurried, like it had been written faster or under different circumstances. And the dates were all within the last 3 years, far more recent than anything else in that unit. Some of the entries were dated after the date the lawyer gave me as Roy's time of death. I called my daughter that night. I didn't tell her everything. I told her to pay attention to anyone who seemed to be watching her, to trust her instincts, and to call me immediately if anything felt off. She asked me why, and I told her not to worry. I've since had her move to a different dorm. I haven't told her the real reason. I don't know if Roy made that second folder before he died, or if someone else did. I don't know who Roy actually was, or how he inserted himself into my family's life before I was old enough to remember him doing it. I don't know if he was working alone, or if there is someone else who knows everything he knew, and is still watching. What I know is that a man I barely remembered spent the better part of my entire life documenting mine without my knowledge. And that when he died, whoever picked up where he left off turned their attention to my daughter. I moved to this city to start over. I check the locks every night before I go to bed. It doesn't feel like enough anymore.